Last week we learned that when I say discontentment, when it flourishes in our lives, we begin so many times to compare ourselves with those that are around us, and maybe we compare about the bank accounts that someone else has, or maybe the neighborhood where someone else lives, the house that they live in. I even shared that sometimes we compare the number of bag of peanuts somebody gets next to us. Well, today we're going to take a look at 1 Timothy chapter 6 again, and we're going through this chapter. Now, it's toward the back of the New Testament. If you have a Bible and you're opening it and you see any book that starts with a T, you're getting close. There's 5 New Testament books that start with a T, and if you get near any of those, you're close to 1 Timothy. Today, what we are going to talk about, you can see, Get Over Yourself is a series, but generosity over selfishness. Today, we want to encourage you to be less selfish and more generous. You know, usually 3 times a year is about the amount of times that I will share a message that talks with you on giving and generosity. If Jesus were your preacher, he would talk about it quite a bit more. For in the parables of Jesus, 1/3 of his parables, 33% of the time, he talks about our relationship to money, and he talks about generosity, and he talks about giving. When it comes to preaching on the topic of generosity, sometimes there are people that will kind of squirm, and it's because maybe they have a tendency to not be as generous and a little bit more selfish. But honestly, those that are generous, they look forward to messages like this because they want you to know. They want you to know how much joy and peace it brings into a life when you determine to be generous to the Lord, to His church, and before God. Loving God and loving people, that's one of the things that Jesus taught us to do. And sometimes we get caught into loving the stuff and all the things that are in this world. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9 and 10 says, "Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." Now, money in itself, money isn't bad. Money isn't good. You know, money in itself is just neutral. But money has a way of getting into our minds, and it can captivate us until we kind of fall in love with the stuff that it gets for us. And it can become an obsession that can creep into our thinking. You know, it can make us discontent, and it can make us, I guess you could say, downright selfish at times. Now, things in money can become more important to us than generosity, than to giving. When we pursue money more than generosity, you can be absolutely sure that we are putting money in a place where God doesn't want it to be in our lives. And today, what we're going to talk about are these verses from 1 Timothy 6, verse 9 and 10. But I just want to ask you 2 questions. If you're following the outline that's in the bulletin, if you're not, open it up and you'll see it there in the middle. I've got 2 questions that I want to ask you. And I just want you to wrestle with these 2 questions with the idea of generosity and selfishness. Question number 1, what are your plans? Now, in this verse, and I go back, it says, those who want to get rich. Now, where it says want to, the word is not like the typical word that you would think about when you're talking about wanting or desiring something. Those who want to, it's a little bit deeper word. It's talking about planning, deeply thinking and planning towards something. They really are planning on ways that they can get more. Well, you've got it in your mind. Now, Paul isn't warning us about a desire inside to be successful. That's not what he's talking about at all. Having things, that's not what he's talking about. He's saying that if in your plans and the things of what you're going to do, that you're always working towards your dream house, or you're always working towards this super vacation, or you're always working towards retirement and investments, or just your own comfort and desires, if that's the main thing that you have going, then maybe you ought to step back and take a look at yourselves in these ways with your plans. What do your plans revolve around? Think about that. You're the only person that can answer that question. It's not anybody else that can answer it about you. It's you that would know the answer to this question. What consumes your thinking? What dominates the thought process? Do you dream about and think about how you can be generous and how you can help others? Do you plan accordingly? Do you make plans accordingly so that you can be generous? Do you schedule your life? Do you schedule your time? Do you schedule your budget to reflect others more than we do ourselves? Now, in the Scriptures, there's three types of giving that are talked about. Now, the first one that I want you to see is tithing. Tithing is kind of a starting point. It's where people can jump in and begin to give. This is how it was in the very beginning. If you take your Bibles, I know there's a company or a Christian business called Answers in Genesis. If you want to look for some answers in the book of Genesis, there's all kinds of answers in there about sin, about creation, it talks about tithing in the book of Genesis. It's in Genesis, it's in Leviticus. You'll find it basically throughout the Bible. Now, a tithe is a tenth of our income, or what we have, a tenth of what we have. And that's a biblical standard of where we can begin with our giving. A tenth portion belongs to God. 10% of what you make, you should give back a portion to God. Now, a phrase heard in the Old Testament that if you look and study through it, it's that we give of the first fruits. Now, it was an agrarian culture where agriculture was extremely important and people would make their living. Well, they would tithe off of their crops. They would tithe off of their plants that they planted because they wanted to honor God before anything else of the fruit that came into their lives. And Scripture is clear that the tithe is the first part that you should give. Now, it's not a legalistic thing, like all of a sudden I get $1 and I have to, before I spend any of that dollar, go give a dime away. Now it's not a legalistic thing that's there, but tithing is it a part of your game plan? Is giving to the Lord and in His church and the work of the church, is it part of our game plan, or is it kind of like, well, if I have any money left over in my life, I'll give something to God? He should be a priority in our lives. His church should be a priority in our lives. His work in this world should be a priority in our lives. Some people say, well, the New Testament's not really that clear about tithing. Well, it really does say something about tithing. And it was Jesus that said this. Jesus is being confronted by a group of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And in their hypocrisy, this is found in Matthew chapter 20. Oh boy, let's see. Where have I gone here? Matthew 23:23. It says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law, Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices," like of their spices, "of the mint and dill and cumin," the things that they grow. And then he says, "But you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." Now Jesus goes ahead to say, "You should have practiced the latter," and he's talking about tithing, "without neglecting the former." Now, if Jesus had ever wanted to have an opportunity to eliminate the concept of tithing, he had a perfect opportunity here, but he didn't do that. Instead, what he does is he encourages. He says, you should have practiced this other. You should have practiced the latter, the first thing, tithing. He seems to be saying, don't neglect the tithe, but also don't make the bigger mistake of falling out of living out your faith. You should be living out your faith with these justice and mercy and faithfulness. Now, regardless of what a person is walking, regardless of when a person is walking on this earth, whether it was in the very beginning, or whether it was in the first century, or whether it's in the 21st century, the first fruits have always belonged to God. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2. I don't have it on the screen, but it says, set aside a sum based upon your income to give to the Lord on the first day of the week. On the first day of the week, come and give that. In Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, it says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse that there may be food in my house. It's talking about, the church and the Lord's house. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. This is the only time in all the Bible God issues a challenge and says, test him on this. He's saying, I dare you. I dare you to do it. You're thinking, I can't do this. I dare you to do it. And he says, I will throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out such a blessing that there won't be room enough for it all. Now, he doesn't promise you that you're going to get a raise. He doesn't promise you you're going to get a promotion. He doesn't promise you a new Porsche in your garage or a Prius, either one. He doesn't do that. What he does is he promises that God will supply all of our needs. Now, some of you may be new to the church, and maybe you're new to this teaching from the Scriptures. And I don't know, maybe you've been here 3 or 4 weeks in church, and you're going, oh, wow, hold on to your wallet today. The preacher's after our wallet today. Well, you know what? Jesus doesn't want your wallet. Jesus wants your heart. That's what he wants. He wants your heart. And just as God challenges you, and he says, test me in this, I would say the same thing. I would challenge you. If you're not tithing, I would challenge you to do it and see what God does in your life. It's a step of faith. It's a big thing to do. But you should note that God, he kind of talks about a percentage, not an amount, but a percentage. And God is saying that if you give a tithe, I will do more for you on that 90% that's left than you ever. Maybe you've struggled in the past with 100%. Well, I'll help you because I'll bless you. And as you live your life, there'll be less of a struggle going on. If tithing is new to you, I would just encourage you to pray about it, to study the Scriptures about it. And just watch how our God will be obedient and show up. And when I say obedient, he will be true to the words that he has said. As you're trying to be obedient to him, he will, his promises are always true. Now, there's another type of giving that you'll find in the Scriptures, and this is free will giving. We're talking about generosity and being generous, and what should you do if you're going to go beyond the kind of standard that's set up in the Scriptures? Well, that's the tithe. Well, what if you want to do more and you want to give a little bit more? Over the years, probably some of the guys have watched me here at the church, and whenever an offering plate is passed, I always try to make sure that I put something in it. I had a preacher that kind of mentored me. He married Kathy and I. His name was Brad Coffey. He was a graduate of Cincinnati Bible Seminary, but he was my preacher for a number of years. And he said, Larry, don't ever miss out on a blessing of when that offering plate comes by. Put something in it. God wants to bless you. And I've just always thought about that. Good grief, I pass out money for my kids whenever they're near me, making sure that they put money in the offering. I want them blessed. And as I say that teasingly, Kathy usually writes out the tithe check. She did, this morning she does, and she's always done that. But when I give to the church at offering time, I'm always giving an offering because I don't usually, maybe she doesn't trust me with a checkbook. I don't know. But anyway, you kind of understand. Daryl and I were talking about a fella named Wayne Smith They wouldn't give the guy his paycheck at the church because he'd give it away. They had to give it to his wife every week because she needed some of the money to live on. And Wayne would just give everything away. Well, there's a lot of ways that you can give extra and give free will offerings in this church. I was thinking about Operation Christmas Child when you guys filled over 200 and some odd boxes. I think about the college boxes that, were sent off this last week. We have Fifth Sunday offerings around here at the church. You can get the blue envelopes are put away, but if you want to give the Dominican Republic trip, well, there's Sunday school offerings. If you come to Sunday school here and you're in an adult class, usually there's 4 envelopes, and there's different missions that we encourage if you'd like to support one of those missionaries. Kathy and I support a little girl each month through Life of Hope Ministries. We also support a literature ministry where they are translating books in foreign languages. We give to the church. We give to, we give free will offerings to different things. The church in Philippi was a church where they gave and they supported the Apostle Paul. He was a missionary that had gone out. And not every dollar that you give to this church, stays in this church. I don't know, close to, 12-15% goes on and helps missionaries around the country. From the Manhattan Christian College kids that were here the other day, to Lakeview Christian Camp, to when I say there's ones that we support within the state where they start new churches, to missionaries all around the globe. But you have a right to give free will offerings anytime, and I would encourage you to do that. But now let me tell you about another type of giving that's in the Scriptures. It's a scriptural thing, and it's sacrificial giving. Now, sacrificial giving is something that's kind of, it's incredible, and it's unusual. It's where you will sacrifice, extra and maybe a lot more than normal because you have a desire to see God's work go forward in a specific area. I was introduced to something when I was a freshman in college called Faith Promise. They asked me to say, well, Lord, if you'll give me an extra $1,000 this year, I'll give it to this mission. And I did that. And God provided, and I provided for some on the mission field. But there are times, I don't know, that Kathy and I have gone through some of this sacrificial giving. And I would encourage you, if the chance comes and you really feel challenged by God, I would encourage you to consider that. I remember when we built this church in Bossier City, Louisiana. And when I say that, this was a church that I served at this church 22 years. We had built a little building in the back at some point in time, and I know we probably sacrificed for that. But when we built another building, it was like $650,000. We encouraged all of the board to give extra where they'd given, and for a span of months, I think it was like 36 months, over the next 3 years, what can you give above your normal giving? And a lot of people responded to that. I was reading a story of the Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. Bob Russell was a preacher there for a lot of years. And when they relocated from one campus to another, they had about 9,000 people attending that church. Huge church. Well, they decided when they built the new one, they would ask the board, for the next 42 months, could you give a double tithe? Now think about that. I want that to sink into you. Now think about it. If you tithe twice as much for 42 months. And these people met that challenge and did that. Oh, my nephew is named Hezekiah Barnes, and Hezekiah works at this church. He's over the IT, and of course they have about 25,000 that attend this campus, but they have like 5 satellite churches that meet in different places around the Louisville area. But when you think about that, it all goes back to a time when a group of people were really challenged through a capital stewardship campaign to stretch and to really sacrifice. I don't know what may be in front of you that may be something challenging you. I know as the kids go to the Dominican Republic, they're really challenged to try to raise a lot of funds, and they're doing that to go to the Dominican Republic. But I ask you, what are your plans? What are your plans? Second question that I want to ask you is, what are you committed to? When you think about finances and when you think about how you're going to use the money that God has blessed you with, what are you committed to? 1 Timothy 6:10 says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." Now this is the most misquoted verse in the Bible, the most misquoted verse in all of the Bible. Money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's what a lot of people think that it says. That's not what it's saying. It says the love of money. I don't think that there's anyone in this whole crowd that would stand up today and say, yeah, I want to announce that I love money more than I love people. I love money and things more than I love the Lord. I don't think anybody would say anything like that. And yet sometimes with our lives, by our actions, and by the way that we handle our finances and stuff, maybe we kind of do say things like that. But do you know that when I say this, money is a tool, and we don't want you as Christians in this church. We don't want you to learn to love money. We want you to realize that money is neutral. Money is a tool. And money has the power to save. I don't know if you think about it, but money has the power to save. You know, when we were at that church and there was about 100 people, and all of a sudden we jumped up and our attendance just went way higher. Or that church that I said was running 9,000, all of a sudden they're running huge numbers. And it's because people sacrificed to make a difference. And there are people that have come to the Lord because of sacrificial giving. We sit in a building every single Sunday, which most of us didn't have a whole lot to do with giving the monies that made this place happen. But as I say that to you, I don't want you to be a slave to money. I don't want you to be a slave to debt. Oh, I always encourage people to do the best that they can to get out of debt. Right now in our church, and at the first of each year, we have this class that goes on, Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace, and it's a class that's offered, and it gives you a great opportunity to understand how to handle money. When I go through premarital counseling with couples, you know, we hit a little bit on this because we want people to understand how to handle money and budget money. We want you to understand how to get out of debt and stay out of debt. Probably never heard of Bob McEwen. He was a congressman in Ohio. One day, Bob took his younger teenage son to McDonald's, and he got him a Coke, large order fries, and they were just sitting visiting, and he got him a Coke. Well, he sat down across from his son at the table, and when they brought the fries out, you know, they were hot and they were salty and just looked great. And Bob reached over to grab a couple of the French fries when his son pulled them back from him and kind of guarded, hey, this is my stuff, this is my stuff. And he said, you know, it just kind of bothered me. Put up this kind of invisible shield, my fries. And I thought, well, okay. And said, but then I just began to think, doesn't he realize I'm the one who bought all this? Doesn't he realize I'm the one who gave him the fries? Doesn't he realize that I've got enough money in my pocket? If I really wanted to, I could go over there and buy a whole pile of these fries and come have him dump them on his head. You know, I could provide him with all the fries that he ever wanted, if that's what, you know, if he wanted me to do. But you know, and he said, when I was having these thoughts go through my head about my son and the French fries, he said, then it hit me. That's the way I used to act towards God. God blesses us. And he says, why don't you come and sit down with me at the table, and we can enjoy some of the blessings I've given you. But I put up my hands and say, these are my fries. This is my stuff. He said, does the all-powerful, almighty God of heaven say to himself, don't they realize that I'm the one who gave them everything that they have? Don't they realize that every good and perfect gift is from above, passed on to us by the Father of lights, it says in the book of James. I could bury them right now in blessings if I wanted to, or I could make them really struggle in this life. But God politely, like this gentleman, leaves that decision up to you. It's got to be your choice. But the reality is, all the blessings belong to Him. All those fries are His. Psalm 116 verse 12 says, what shall I return to the Lord for all His goodness to me? Oh, wow. It's a beautiful place where we live. We drove the other day back and forth to Kearney, and it's gorgeous seeing the snow like it is right now. Older version of the New International says, how can I repay the Lord for all His goodness to me? Well, we can't. That's obvious. But we can learn to be like Him, and we can learn to be generous. As I read another piece of this verse, 1 Timothy 6:10, it says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And it says, some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. In the second part of that verse, Paul is saying, he says in the first part that the love of money can become a sin. But he's saying some people so eager for money leave the faith altogether. And you say, well, Larry, that sounds kind of extreme. You're saying because I'm just a little bit selfish with money that you're warning me about leaving Christianity altogether? Well, I'm just reading you what Paul was inspired to write, that God actually passed down for you and I. But I ask the question, what are you committed to? Where it says some people eager, so we see that word eager for money. The word eager literally means to stretch yourself out, to yearn for. Some people are pursuing money. Some people are chasing money. Some people are loving money. It's really a commitment of our lives. But the Bible teaches us that God is the one who is the provider. He's given us the provisions. It's all about a commitment. Jesus says at one point in time, you can't serve two masters. You'll love one or hate the other, and you can't serve God and money. Now, Paul isn't saying don't work hard. Paul isn't saying don't provide for your family. Paul's the one who wrote, if you don't work, you don't eat. Paul's the one, who would tell you and encourage you to provide for your family. The Bible teaches us to do that. But in these verses, I'm saying, what are you committed to? You can't serve two masters because you'll always want more. Always wanting more. How do you approach the French fries your Father in heaven has given you? What's your heart like? I remember I used to coach Little League Baseball. I love to play baseball, and I coached my kids in softball and baseball. One of the guys had to go, he was 37 years of age. His name was Jim Harner. If you were to look at Jim was as fit as he could be. He was a coach, and I had coached with him. We coached in things. We also worked in scouts together. 37 years of age when Jim had a heart attack. I just never believed it. There was a guy that worked with Kathy. We ate lunch with him quite often, him and his wife. His name was Arlie Robbins. He's passed away at this point in time, but Arlie was a guy, if you looked at Arlie, you would never pick out that he had heart trouble. If you were to line up 20 people up here and say, which one do you think? I promise you'd never pick these two, either of these two. But when they take a echocardiogram of the heart, It looks at the heart, and one of the things that they're looking for inside is the blood flow, and is there an area where the blood is not coming out, where it's not flowing from, it's going in, but there seems to be some type of a blockage that's reducing flow. And you can't tell by looking on the outside of somebody what their heart is like. And literally the same is true with all of mankind, whether it's men or women. If you were to line up 20 people on this stage, I promise you wouldn't be able to tell which one was generous or which one was not. You couldn't tell. Giving is a very personal thing. But when it comes to the heart is where generosity begins. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." But sometimes we allow our own selfishness to cause a blockage in the heart. And when that happens, the flow of God's grace and the flow of God's generosity through us can be thwarted. And your heart is hindered by your own selfishness and self-centeredness and greed. Now I'll say this, when you take someone to the hospital and there's problems with their heart, doctors don't take any chances when it comes to the heart. But I've seen plenty of Christians who do. On the surface, I've seen plenty who will give the impression that all is well and everything's fine, that the Lord is first place in their life, and they claim that they're completely sold out. But if that truly were the case, they would learn to be generous, and they would learn to give with all their hearts rather than with a clenched fist, saying, I wish I didn't have to do this. We are never more like God than when we give. Remember that old verse? For God so loved the world that He gave. We're never more like God than when we give. Would you be standing with me? We're going to pray.